Meanwhile, Martin quickly and deftly copied Riella's notes into his own notebook. Once he finished, he wondered what else he could do, not content to stop at the notepad. After a few minutes of searching, he finally found the flower scissors that belonged to her. An evil grin spread across his face as he thought about what he could do next and hurried to act before the mistress arrived. With a quick swing, Martin began striking the scissors against different surfaces to dull the blades. But he didn't stop there. He went to the flowers that Riella had planned to arrange that day and decided to destroy them as well. He tossed the bouquet into water, knowing it would ruin the flowers, and once he'd finished his destructive tasks, he smiled with satisfaction, feeling better after causing harm. Quickly, he left the greenhouse, hoping to avoid being seen by Riella and to pretend that he had no part in the damage. What he didn't know, however, was that he had been watched the entire time by Lucien and Han, who were both furious with his behavior. The Archduke inspected the damage, noting that the scissors were completely destroyed and the flowers were already beginning to fade. Han, still seething with anger, remembered how he had forbidden Riella from going to the palace, partly because of how she had been treated. Yet, as he reflected on how eager Riella had been to begin her work, he calmed himself, realizing that she wasn't to blame for anything. It was his own fault for not protecting her from the palace tricks. Now it was up to him to fix the problem. Lucien, approaching Han, informed him that the crystal had recorded the entire scene. He also confessed that personally he had no desire to forgive Martin. Meanwhile, Riella, who didn't want to face Martin again, was still worried about the plan, but decided to take a longer walk. She tried to enjoy the beautiful scenery of the royal garden, but found it hard to shake the feeling that she was relying too heavily on two high-class powers. However, it was too late to change anything, so she thought about thanking the guys and wanted to lend Lucien the necessary stone, giving Han glowing flowers. Just then she was called by Supia from the library, who was also walking through the royal garden. Seeing that Riella wasn't busy, the librarian asked for her help as she couldn't manage alone. Riella agreed and asked what needed to be done. Supia told her to tie ribbons on every tree and flower, except for the roses. Riella was surprised that, in a garden full of a variety of plants, only the roses would remain untouched. Supia explained that this was Samasi's decision, and no one argued with the famous florist. Riella, excited about the changes in the garden, hadn't expected them to be so drastic. She realized that many strong and healthy plants would be dug up, which was a pity, but it wasn't her decision to make. As Supia went to the western part of the garden, Riella went to the eastern part, tying ribbons on the plants as she went, feeling increasingly sad about the plants that would be lost. Suddenly, she noticed a figure working in front of her. Curious, she approached and discovered that it was Lady Chloe, who was working with the flowers in the garden. From the expression on her face, it was clear that she wasn't in the best emotional state, so Riella decided not to approach her. Chloe seemed confused, not knowing whether she should ask Bennett to leave so she could continue her work. Then Riella overheard Chloe, sitting in front of the peonies, swearing loudly at Sir March, not noticing anyone nearby. Bennett quickly jumped up with an armful of beautiful peonies and headed back to the palace. Riella was puzzled, realizing that Chloe looked incredibly angry, despite not having spoken to Sir Mars today. She guessed that the cause of their quarrel was likely simpler than it appeared at first. Looking toward the palace, Riella thought that perhaps she could mediate between the two florists later. Meanwhile, Martin walked through the palace in an unusually good mood, whistling cheerfully. He had just received approval for all the sketches he had stolen from Riella, which made him happy. The only thing bothering him was that Lady Chloe seemed to be constantly checking his work. He quickly concluded that he couldn't make any changes to Riella's sketches without her noticing. Riella, on the other hand, was becoming more suspicious of her assistant's behavior. She had noticed strange things happening when Martin trained alone and started to get the feeling that something wasn't quite right. At the end of their conversation, Riella even asked if Martin had a double, which surprised him. He laughed loudly at the suggestion, claiming that he was just fickle. Martin, who had also been annoyed by Riella's secretive peeking, began to imagine a new plan. He stood before a mirror, admiring his face and body, thinking that if he appeared attractive enough, Riella might pay more attention to him. As he analysed her behaviour, he convinced himself that she must like him since she always greeted him first and occasionally looked away in embarrassment. What he didn't realise was that Riella was simply bored by him. Lost in daydreams, Martin imagined a distant future, where he was an important man who asked Riella for sketches, and she obediently handed over her notebook filled with beautiful flower arrangements. He imagined carefully studying the notebook, ensuring everything was perfect, and asking Riella if she had any questions for him. She, as his wife, would smile happily and say she was content, delighted by her husband's success. Sighing contentedly, Martin thought it would be ideal if something like that came to pass. As he walked to the greenhouse, he decided it would be a good idea to invite Riella to dinner next time, but she would have to pay for it, since she was much richer than he was. Just then, Sir Mars loudly entered the palace, shouting for Chloe. All the servants were shocked by his arrival, unsure of what he wanted, as no one had touched him. A little later, Lady Bennet appeared and asked why Sir Mars was causing such a ruckus. "Dan!" the old man yelled at her, accusing her of being impudent for someone who had done such a terrible thing. Chloe, confused, had no idea what he was referring to, and calmly asked him to explain. Sir Mars, still furious, shouted that she had been avoiding answering. Chloe, raising her voice, demanded an explanation. The old man, exasperated, said he had even considered accepting an apology from her when he discovered the setup. He ordered the servants who had accompanied him to quickly bring the bouquets from the palace. Chloe immediately recognised the bouquets, recalling that she had personally sent them to the royal chambers for the Queen the previous day. Sir Maurice joyfully concluded that the girl didn't deny her involvement with the flowers. Martin, curious about the conversation, tried to make his way through the crowd. However, when he finally saw the bouquets the old man had brought, he froze in fear. Martin had made those bouquets just the day before, but clearly he hadn't come up with the ideas himself. At that moment, Sir Maurice handed Chloe a paper with sketches, asking for her comments. Chloe looked at the sheet, compared the date, and glanced at the old man, puzzled. The sketches depicted the same compositions she had sent to the palace yesterday, but they were designed by the florist 3 months ago. Furious, Lady Bennet angrily called for Martin, remembering very well that he was the one who had created these flowers. She demanded that he come forward immediately and explain how this could have happened. Sir Maurice also started calling for Martin, urging him to appear, or else things would go badly for him. The crowd parted as Martin froze, realising there was nowhere to go. In a panic, Martin screamed that he had done nothing wrong and blamed everything on Riella. A little later, Riella was unexpectedly summoned to the palace for proceedings. As she walked, a crowd of servants continued whispering rumours that Riella might be a traitor. Sir Maurice was embarrassed to suspect the lady, but still felt the need to check if she was guilty. Surprisingly calm, Riella responded to the florist's doubts, asking what the issue was. The old man explained that Martin's recent work, under Chloe's direction, suspiciously resembled his own design. The only person to whom Sir Maurice had shown these compositions was Riella, and Martin claimed that she herself gave him these ideas. Not at all perturbed, Riella asked, "Are you suggesting that I stole your ideas and gave them to my assistant?" The old man hesitated, and Riella continued, pressing the point. What if it's true? Sir Maurice demanded to know what Riella meant by saying such things, suspecting her of betrayal. Without further explanation, the lady continued, suggesting that the better Lady Chloe did her job, the more honour she would receive from the Queen. As a result, Lady Bennet could become impulsive and begin using others for her own purposes. Chloe immediately protested that her skills were already good, but Riella responded, "So, Sir Maurice must have set up this whole situation to discredit his student." Lady Bennet was surprised by such an assumption, as she had never considered this possibility. The old man couldn't stay silent, declaring that he would never treat his students that way. Eventually, both Chloe and Sir Maurice admitted they were not guilty, but the bouquets remained stolen. Riella reminded the florist that they couldn't solve the problem because they had quarrelled and acted alone. After listening to her, the old man and the lady realised her words were true, though they were reluctant to admit it. Sir Maurice suggested focusing on the theft instead of the quarrel and moved on to that issue. Riella confidently said she knew who was responsible for everything. The crowd listened carefully as she pointed to Martin, saying, "That man stole all the notes from my notebook." Martin, refusing to accept guilt, began shouting that Riella was lying. He convinced those around him that the lady had given him the ideas and now was blaming him. Riella had expected this response and had prepared a backup plan. She pulled out the crystal of the image from her dress pocket and showed it to everyone. The crystal shimmered brightly, revealing the moment Martin had brazenly stolen her sketches and notes. Desperate to deny his wrongdoing, Martin tried to grab the crystal and break it, thinking it would erase the evidence. But before he could act, Archduke Haun appeared from behind and knocked him out with a single move. The last thing Martin saw before losing consciousness was the face of the king's brother. He was soon taken by servants to be cared for by his relatives. Martin woke up the next day to find he had been fired from his position at the palace garden and blacklisted by Sir Maurice and Lady Chloe within the florist community. Burning with anger, Han demanded Martin leave the capital, and soon after, Sir Maurice apologised to Madame Riella, admitting he had been wrong to suspect her. The girl graciously accepted the apology, acknowledging that Martin was indeed a villain. The old man then turned his attention to resolving another matter, his conflict with his student. He admitted that it was his fault for making Chloe angry. Chloe, still upset about his decision to turn the garden into a rose-only garden, lowered her head and struggled to find the right words. Lady Bennet, now realising the true reason behind Chloe's anger, spoke up, confirming her suspicions. She expressed her love for peonies, not roses, and had only become a florist to learn more about her favourite flowers. Just then, the door to the room suddenly shook as assistants burst in, having overheard the conversation. The blue-haired assistant immediately declared his love for sunflowers and insisted they stay in the garden, prompting others to argue for their favourite flowers as well. Sir Maurice listened carefully, realising that he had made a mistake by not consulting his subordinates earlier. Sighing, the old man asked everyone to share their opinions in the evening. Later that night, when Han and Riella returned to the mansion, Han went straight to study the second door again. Unexpectedly, Riella arrived at the Archduke's office, asking if she was interrupting. The Archduke gave her permission to stay, and she confessed that she couldn't sleep because she kept thinking about the good things. Cheerfully, Riella showed Han her honorary membership ticket in the Royal Society of Gardeners. Han praised her, then asked if she would still work at the palace the next day. Riella explained that she would only go to the palace once a week, now that Sir Maurice and Cleo had reconciled. Han, puzzled, asked why Riella seemed so calm about Martin's expulsion. Riella explained that she had quickly understood the kind of person Martin was. He had been friendly to everyone except her from the start, viewing her as someone beneath him. Han listened without interrupting, sympathy evident in his eyes. Riella added that she had met many people and learned to understand them. Even Sir Maurice and Chloe clearly wanted peace, but both were still angry with each other. Riella then turned to Han, asking if he was hiding his thoughts using the stone. The Archduke fell silent for a moment before asking if she wanted to know his thoughts. Riella, now nervous, wasn't sure how to respond to such a direct question. She jumped up, trying to change the subject and asking about the second door. Han easily switched the topic and permitted her to examine the door. However, as they pushed the door together, it moved slightly. But when Han tried it alone, there was no result. The realization dawned that the Duchess Hozang might be making mischief again. Suddenly, Nia appeared, having been looking for Riella, and the assistant asked if everything was okay. The girl and Han exchanged a look, both understanding each other without words. Nia then tried pushing the door herself, and to everyone's surprise, it swung open much more easily than before. Han, now unsettled by this discovery, wondered how many people were awake to try the door, as the seals on it still remained a mystery. The next morning, Han wrote down everything he had learned about the door, finding that it opened slightly when several people pushed it together, but not when he tried it alone. Nea's success in opening the door gave them some clues, but the question of the seal's purpose remained unanswered. Frustrated, Han reflected on his failure to open the door alone and tried to come up with new strategies. He also wondered when Riella would return to the palace, as he needed to accompany her. Meanwhile, in the palace, the Queen was discovering why Han had gathered so many people in the mansion. She was informed that it had to do with the Room of Stones. Her Majesty's assistant explained that it was learned that many people were needed to open the second door. At this point, Letitia decided to let it go and pondered the fact that a person had arrived in the kingdom through the Bureau of Foreign Affairs. However, it seemed the Archduke had nothing to do with this, which could mean he might be in danger. The next morning, Han and Riella arrived at the Maurice family's main garden, having been invited there by the elders themselves. They were greeted by the florist and his son, Lucien, who politely asked if they had arrived safely. Riella cheerfully thanked them for the invitation, mentioning that their trip had been wonderful. Since the girl couldn't arrive empty-handed, she brought a gift for Sir Maurice's wife. The old lady was pleased with the gesture, although she found it unnecessary since she was always ready to receive guests. The lady invited Riella to open the gift, which she did, and was shocked by what she found. Somehow, Riella had managed to find a collection of rare dishes that were still unused, and Maurice's wife, being a collector, was delighted. Immediately, she insisted that her husband give Riella several new varieties of dishes in return. Chloe, who was also invited to the tea party, offered the lady jasmine tea that she had personally grown. However, Sir Maurice suggested that the girl should first try rose tea, which angered his student. Lady Bennet, who had begun the conversation, insisted that they should start with her tea, but the old man reminded them that they were in his house. Watching the argument unfold, the lady smiled and thought they looked like a family. Without thinking, she muttered out loud that she was jealous. Han, who was sitting nearby, immediately asked what exactly she was jealous of, and Riella responded that it was the atmosphere. The Archduke remembered that Riella had older sisters, so he didn't quite understand her feelings of envy. The girl explained that her parents had already passed away, and her sisters had long since moved away, leaving her to return to an empty house. She didn't particularly like coming home early to avoid being alone. However, Riella added that everyone had their own circumstances, so it would be foolish to be overly jealous of someone else. Realizing she had shared too many personal details, the girl stopped talking about sad things and smiled. Han unexpectedly thanked her for sharing her thoughts and experiences, ones she hadn't revealed before. He recalled the time when he lived separately from his family, but had faced it without much emotion. Riella, encouraged by his words, continued to chat cheerfully, feeling much more open. As the sun began to set, the lady and Han drove back to the mansion, where they were invited to visit again. Riella, having eaten a lot, was feeling stuffy in the carriage and tired from the day's events. She soon fell asleep, resting her head on the Archduke's shoulder. Han didn't mind at all. He quickly realized how tired she was and tried not to disturb her for the rest of the trip. The next morning, Riella woke up early, feeling rested and full of energy. Performing her usual morning ritual, she picked up her coffee and newspaper, sat comfortably, and began to read. However, the first headlines greatly shocked her, fully waking her from her sleep. The newspaper announced that Princess Charlotte had arrived in Cardia to arrange a marriage with Archduke Han. Since the guy hadn't told anyone about this, she was taken aback. When Han entered the dining room, he was greeted by silence. He genuinely couldn't understand why everyone was acting so cold towards him, even the servants. Suspiciously, he looked around and asked what was going on. Nia was the only one brave enough to confront him, loudly asking why he hadn't mentioned that he was getting married. Han replied that he wasn't planning to marry, but they threw the newspaper in front of him and demanded an explanation. Taking the paper in his hands, Han was surprised, as he had never heard of anything like this. He loudly declared that the newspapers were wrong, and that he had never even heard of Princess Charlotte. In response, Riella smiled deceitfully and said that the Archduke wasn't obligated to explain anything to her. Her emotions were so overwhelming at that moment that she didn't care about anything else. Wishing him happiness in his personal life, she quickly ran to her room. Han was left alone, trying to understand what was happening. The Archduke put on formal clothes and went to see his brother in the palace. The king was already aware of the situation and casually remarked that he had told Han to find someone. Han did not want to deal with marriage issues, as the match seemed appropriate to him. Additionally, Princess Charlotte was a good candidate, though her true purpose for the visit remained unclear. The king, however, had to ask what Han would do if the princess really wanted to marry him. Han unwaveringly responded that he would withdraw the articles and not meet with Charlotte. The Queen, however, thought it was a bad idea, which surprised the Archduke. He turned to her, and Letitia explained that previously articles had not been withdrawn due to their implausibility, so there was no need to do so now. Han, who was not happy with this suggestion, clenched his fists, knowing it was dangerous to object to the Queen. She added that if there were no special reasons to act, it was better not to draw attention to the matter. The Queen hoped the Archduke would agree to wait for the princess's arrival and then inquire about her true intentions. Charlotte had notified everyone that she had purchased stones at the Sordia auction and brought some as a gift, so Han could not afford to be rude. Thus, he reluctantly agreed to wait for her arrival. On the day of her arrival, rumours spread throughout the city. Princess Charlotte, while riding in a carriage through Cardia, mentally noted that this country was very similar to a fertile one. This was surprising, because dragons usually burned the land, making it hard for the country to recover. The first to overcome this damage was Elle, a powerful stonemancer and the third king of Cardia, whose bloodline and strength had been passed down to the current king's younger brother, Han Errol Pendragon. The princess thought sadly that the Archduke was very similar to her, both second children who received little attention. However, Charlotte was pleased that she had obtained an important stone at the auction which she believed would help her cause. When she arrived, she was met by Han, who demonstrated maximum politeness. Although Charlotte was pleased with the warm welcome, she was unaware of how much Han disliked being near her. The servants around them began to whisper, thinking the couple was well suited for each other. Later, Han and Charlotte shared tea and discussed social matters. The princess revealed that she would be staying until the flower festival, and Han thought with irritation that it would be impossible to send her back early. As she prepared for their conversation, the princess asked to speak to him without witnesses. This was what Han had feared the most, but he had no choice but to comply. As they spoke, Han asked why she had published the article about their marriage. Charlotte, folding her hands, pleaded with him not to be angry, explaining that the article had been an order from her brother, King Tedia. He believed it would be useful for negotiations. Charlotte further explained that those living near the dragon hibernation site would support their alliance. The Archduke firmly declared that he categorically refused the marriage, no matter the reason. Charlotte tried to lighten the atmosphere by claiming that there hadn't even been an official proposal yet. When Han hesitated, she asked if there was anything else he wanted to discuss. Han couldn't answer right away, and, as he thought about it, he felt the subtle presence of magic from a stone unregistered in the palace. He immediately stood up to search for the source, but the magic disappeared as quickly as it had come. Charlotte also felt something, but wasn't sure of her senses. Han decided to check the palace, asking Charlotte to remain where she was. As soon as he left, the princess breathed a sigh of relief. She had been afraid that she had fallen under magic's influence. She realized it was her fault for hiding the fact that she had submitted the article herself, and that she had used the crystal to trigger the magic. She had broken the stone into fragments and packed them carefully, knowing Han would be unable to trace the source. However, Charlotte was prepared to take similar risks again, as the effects of the crystal were cumulative. She was certain that inside Han lay a greedy personality, one she hoped to awaken, believing he would become an ally in her cause. Meanwhile, the girl admitted that she would like to serve Charlotte forever because of her qualities. However, the princess, already tired of everything before even reaching the capital, didn't want to listen to her assistant. She had deliberately spread a rumor about a possible marriage with Archduke Haun and then visited a rich auction near the city of Soria. There, after much difficulty, she acquired a garnet stone. Now the girl had to endure the rejection of the young mistress, all because she didn't want to live in the shadow of her mediocre brother, the king. Everyone around called Charlotte the Rose of Tedia for her beauty, but the girl could only smile sweetly, which truly bothered her. Now, mentally turning to Han, she hoped he was experiencing the same feelings. After all, the Archduke was much more skilled than his older brother, but had to live in his royal shadow. Charlotte believed that Han now kept his claws hidden and his temper tamed, but that was only temporary. The garnet stone had the power to bring out the deepest desires, and it was this stone that the girl intended to direct toward him. Charlotte planned to make a puppet out of the Archduke, hoping he would follow all his emotions and ultimately take her hand, seeking to overthrow his brother. The next day, after lunch, Riella was about to leave the room when she found the Archduke standing at the door. He remained silent and refused to leave, despite having promised to return to the palace for business. The lady asked if something had happened, and he explained that he had discussed state boundaries with Charlotte earlier, which led him to think of Riella. For some reason, he felt an urge to see her. He couldn't admit it, though, and instead said that all checks in the palace were complete. When the lady left, the Archduke pondered deeply, then called his assistant. Nia turned to him with a slight dissatisfaction, as she still didn't love him, though she had become somewhat accustomed to him. He asked if Riella had a white dress for the reception, and if not, to have it ready. That same day, Riella, having successfully escaped from the Archduke, joyfully arrived in the royal garden. However, to her horror, the greenhouse was shrouded in darkness and despondency, despite there being no obvious reason for trouble. Riella asked what had happened, and Chloe revealed that Princess Charlotte had rejected all the flower bouquets, including one from Sir Maurice and Lady Bennet. The saddest part was that the used flowers could no longer be sent elsewhere due to their marriage status, and they would simply be thrown away. Barely holding back tears, the old gardener shouted about how young, inexperienced Charlotte couldn't possibly understand flowers. Ignoring his complaints, Chloe asked Riella to help arrange new bouquets, and the girl immediately agreed to bring fresh flowers from the warehouse to speed up the process. When Riella arrived at the garden administration warehouse, she faced the difficult task of selecting the right flowers. She wondered if the princess had a favourite type of rose or disliked them entirely. Eventually, she decided on Gypsophila, as it seemed the most neutral option. However, when she parted the flowers, she felt a sharp pain. She had scratched herself on a rose. Riella tried to ignore the injury, but the bleeding was more than she expected. She quickly searched for something to stem the flow of blood and noticed a bucket of water. She carefully dipped her hand into it without touching the wilted flowers, and when the bleeding stopped, she took the flowers and left, unaware of what had transpired behind her. Later, one of the assistants entered the warehouse, planning to pick more flowers for the bouquet. He saw a large, beautiful rose standing alone and, not understanding why it hadn't been included, he took it to add to the composition for the demanding princess. That evening, the maid helped Charlotte change clothes after a tiring day. The princess wasn't pleased that the meetings were delayed by unnecessary discussions, but she couldn't change the situation. Wishing to return to the peace of home, Charlotte settled down on the sofa to rest. Her attention was soon drawn to a new bouquet of flowers sent from the Royal Garden Administration. The princess, who considered such bouquets a waste of money and time, initially gave them no thought, but then she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. Among the flowers stood a glowing rose, clearly standing out from the rest. The maid, noticing the mistress's gaze, assumed she would want the flowers removed, But Charlotte claimed it was just her imagination, caused by fatigue. Still, she asked the maid to leave the flowers and let her rest alone. Once the maid left, Charlotte approached the bouquet, once again convinced that the flower was glowing. She had seen such a flower only once before, as a guest at Cardia. Excitedly, she began searching for stones to use with the flower's power, but none seemed right for the task. Then, by accident, Charlotte knocked over a box containing a broken garnet stone. Reaching to grab the fallen stone in frustration, her elbow brushed against the glowing flower. Time seemed to slow for the princess as she desperately hoped the flower wouldn't fall. But it did. It landed next to the scattered fragments of the garnet stone, and an incredibly bright radiance blinded her. When Charlotte could finally open her eyes, she saw that the stone was completely repaired, and the flower had faded. She was filled with despair, realizing the flower had been too precious to use recklessly, and now the stone was too strong to be useful. She reproached herself for acting too hastily, knowing there was nothing she could do to change the situation now. The only option left was to use all of the stone's energy on Han at the right moment. Riella had been eagerly awaiting the morning, as her close friend promised to visit her. When they met, the girls happily went into the living room to chat. Riella was delighted by Melda's delicious cooking, and the two friends laughed as they caught up. At one point, a maid awkwardly entered the room, interrupting their conversation. She handed Riella a letter from a friend. Intrigued, Riella opened it and discovered it was from her second sister. The letter asked about her life and shared news from her own. In a joking or serious tone, the older sister advised Riella to avoid men, especially if she were ever asked to marry. This made Riella think of Lucien, and she immediately realized she should never mention Han to her sister. Meanwhile, the sister described the strange death of one of the sheep, which had somehow died without a head. The woman found it so bizarre that she searched for the head but couldn't find it anywhere. After regaining her composure, the sister apologized to Riella, realizing that such topics were usually not discussed in letters. In parting, she mentioned that she had secured a stable job and would like to visit in the summer. Rena, noticing that her friend had finished reading the letter, asked who it was from. Riella briefly summarized its contents. Rena seemed pleased with the news and then asked if Riella was attending the royal reception. According to the newspaper Rena had read, the reception was going to be particularly lavish, partly because of Princess T's presence. Rena speculated that at the event, people would surely fawn over Han, who was an eligible bachelor. Rena also noted that, despite the fact that the last time the Archduke attended a reception was 5 years ago, he was now obligated to attend due to the princess's invitation. After speaking, Rena observed Riella's face and was surprised to see anger there. When she inquired about it, Riella hastily tried to dismiss her feelings. But Rena wasn't convinced. Suddenly, Rena asked if Riella liked the Archduke, who was apparently on the verge of marrying. Riella blushed fiercely and quickly denied any such affection, claiming she was simply jealous that the Archduke would attend the reception. Rena, with a mischievous grin, nodded, but refrained from saying anything else to avoid embarrassing Riella further. When Rena left to return to her shop, Riella went to the mirror and remembered her friend's question. She couldn't believe she could like the Archduke, so she splashed water on her face, trying to clear her thoughts. In the process, her clothes became almost completely soaked, so she decided to change into something dry. Just as she began to change, she heard a knock on the door. Riella assumed it was her assistant and called out for them to enter. However, when she glanced at the door, she was surprised to see someone tall who didn't quite look like Nia. To her shock, she realized that she had allowed the Archduke to enter instead. Though she was in her underwear, Riella tried to maintain her composure, offering the Archduke a calm smile. However, Han appeared mortified and apologized, claiming that he had entered at the wrong time. Seeing his embarrassment, Riella couldn't contain her own blush, covering herself in a defensive reaction. She squatted down, shouting for Nia. Nia, hearing the shout, rushed into the room to find out what had happened. Han, unsure of what to do, grabbed the nearest blanket and threw it over Riella to shield her from unwanted glances. Just as he did so, Nia arrived, and Riella, now covered in the blanket, explained that she had merely seen a beetle. Though Nia seemed doubtful, she didn't challenge the explanation. After Nia left, Han immediately apologized for the situation. He gently reminded Riella that she should get dressed. Sheepishly, Riella agreed, but tripped over the blanket as she tried to step in it, falling. Fortunately, Han was nearby and managed to catch her. As he held her, Han gently reassured her, saying that the most important thing was that she wasn't hurt. At that moment, Riella recalled Rina's earlier question about whether she liked the Archduke, and she blushed even more, realizing that perhaps she did. Han, oblivious to her thoughts, continued to hold her, as if it were completely normal. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of a servant calling out, announcing that the second door could possibly be opened now. Torn between staying with Riella and answering the call, Han hesitated, but Riella, still flustered, suggested that he go ahead, promising to join him later. Once Han left, Riella reflected on how strange the situation felt and realized she urgently needed to change clothes. Han, meanwhile, hurried through the mansion to the room where the second door was being worked on. He was greeted by one of his assistants, who handed him a report. The Archduke immediately asked how they could proceed to open the door, and the assistant excitedly explained the extensive analysis that had been done, with a list of about 150 people needed to make it work. Han, impressed by the effort, praised the team for their work. The assistant then noted that it had been a long time since Han had requested anything, and the Archduke, surprised by this comment, realized that he had always relied on himself and never bothered others. Though initially disappointed that the door could only be opened with help from others, Han accepted the situation with a smile, understanding that the task from the Duchess had its own meaning. He ordered the team to prepare and, on his count, everyone pushed together to open the door. After some time, the door began to move slightly, though not completely. Poe, observing the situation, noted that something was still missing. At that moment, Riella, now dressed and perfectly composed, arrived, determined to help. She and Nia joined the group, and the crowd made way for them. As they worked together, Han noticed that all the spells had been activated except for one. He decided to change tactics and asked everyone to stop. He then asked for an ability enhancement stone. Moments later, the Archduke activated the stone, amplifying the spell's resonance. To everyone's surprise, the spell suddenly began to give off clues, flowing from person to person straight to Riella.